family mode.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cadigan, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Holy Cross Lunchtime Learning webinar event. This is the latest in our continuing series of web-based presentations that feature Holy Cross faculty members discussing their areas of expertise and research. We're thrilled to have Mathew Schmalz, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, joining us today for a talk entitled Pope Francis in America, Looking Back and Looking Forward, a very interesting and timely topic, especially based on the response to this webinar. Professor Schmalz holds a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. An expert in the papacy, his areas of research focus on global Catholicisms, Hinduism, and modern religious movements. We're so happy to have him join us today. We'll be together for a little under an hour, a great opportunity to relive your Holy Cross classroom experience. Professor Schmalz will speak, and then we'll take questions from you, our listeners, for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions throughout this presentation by checking out the question function located on your webinar toolbar to the right. Thank you for joining us. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Mathew Schmalz.
Thanks, Tom. Be here, and I'm speaking to all of you from O'Kane, and it's a nice day up on the hill, a little bit overcast, but pretty nonetheless, and I'm so grateful to be with all of you here today, at least virtually. And I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, many of my former students who are in the audience, and I remember you all so fondly in the time that we spent together in the classroom, and feel free to contact me afterwards as well and tell me how you think I did. And I'd also like to welcome all of you who I had not had the chance to meet in person, but know that we share a special bond as members of the Holy Cross community. And so for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give an overview of some of the crucial moments in Pope Francis's recent visit to the United States. And in preparing my remarks, I was especially grateful to have questions that many of you had submitted beforehand. So I've tried to respond to those questions in my remarks, and I also look forward to a vigorous and engaging question and answer session after I finish the formal portion of my remarks. And so before we get into the Holy Father's visit, let's review some of the context, some of the crucial events and issues that framed expectations for his visit. And as I'm sure all of you remember, Jorge Maria Bergoglio, Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina, was elected to the papacy in 2013. And his was a surprise election. Many thought that he was too old, and it was especially surprising to me. I often tell this story. Right when the smoke came out of the Sistine Chapel indicating that a new pontiff was elected, I was on the radio, and I could hear the roar of the crowd. I was on with an anchor from the Vatican, and they said to me, "Okay, Professor Schmalz, it's your call right before the new Pope comes out." And I was convinced, since it was such a short election, that it was going to be an Italian. And so I said, it's going to be an Italian. And I was wrong, but I've never been so happy about being wrong in my life. It was really a wonderful moment to see the new pontiff in St. Peter's, and I think we were all very moved by Pope Francis's first appearance. And as a cardinal, Bergoglio did bring with him a reputation for personal holiness, also for austerity, and a strong commitment to social justice. So he was hardly an unknown. It was simply that he was often considered to be too old to assume the reins of the papacy. And of course, he was the first Jesuit elected to the papacy, so it caused quite a stir on campus when he was elected and a great deal of excitement. And so one of the issues we can talk about later, I think, is to what extent Pope Francis marks a theological departure from that articulated by his immediate predecessor, Benedict XVI. But, and that's a complicated question, actually, and I don't think there's really an easy answer to that. But what is certainly clear is that the newly elected Pope, Pope Francis, had a much different style. Obviously, by choosing the name Francis, he was making a nod to St. Francis of Assisi, which was quite distinctive. And so there is a kind of balance between, or interesting intersection between his Jesuit identity and this new, shall we say, Franciscan identity that he assumed. And so from the very start, as I'm sure all of you know and are very aware of, Pope Francis's pontificate was marked by approachability and personal authenticity and warmth. And this change in style also can be seen in his approach to governance, most notably during last year's Synod of Bishops, in which he encouraged a, relatively speaking, quite freewheeling discussion amongst his brother bishops about new pastoral approaches to gay, lesbian, and transgender Catholics, and also to divorced Catholics who have remarried outside the Church. Pope Francis also has authored a remarkable encyclical, Laudato Si, that spoke quite beautifully and forcefully about our obligations to God's creation and the rights of creation itself. So overall, I think that Pope Francis's style, his way of acting and his way of speaking, are actually very Franciscan. He's a kind of poet of the faith, as the editor of First Things magazine has described him. His focus on simplicity, on mercy, are very Franciscan in tone and content, I think. But nonetheless, Pope Francis is still identifiably Jesuit. His emphasis upon examining one's conscience, his belief in the power of prayer and discernment, and his commitment to dialogue and engaging the world are all very Jesuit in character. And so it's a very interesting balance that he's made, and a kind of interesting new path that I think he's articulated or set out for the papacy. And in any case, Pope Francis's pontificate has already been quite remarkable. And in some quarters, it's brought a great deal of hope, hope that the Church will move forward more quickly and substantively to engage contemporary society, and that new forms of governance in the Church might emerge that will more fully involve women and laity. But in other quarters, his pontificate has brought real concerns, and I really do think in this regard that the United States is the geographical epicenter, if you will, of this concern about both the style and substance of this new pontificate. Some Catholics were rather dismayed by Laudato Si, his encyclical, because of its apparent or perceived intervention in the contentious debate about global warming. Other Catholics, particularly some American bishops, were concerned that Pope Francis was giving at least the impression that basic parts of Catholic doctrine and teaching, like the indissolubility of marriage, were somehow open to reconsideration. And so these hopes and these fears in many ways shaped Pope Francis and what he did during his visit to the U.S., and also the reaction both among Catholics and the media to it. So, of course, a lot happened during the papal visit, but for the purposes of this short presentation and the short time we have together, I'd like to focus on 4 moments. The first is Pope Francis's speech at the White House. The second is his speech to American bishops, also in Washington, then his speech to Congress, and then finally his meeting with Kim Davis, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, and certainly was the most controversial or provocative moment during his time in the United States. And so just a note here, I really wanted to include in this presentation a picture of Pope Francis in his Fiat. I just think it's such a great image. He's being trailed, or he was trailed, by all these SUVs and Jeeps and very large Secret Service cars, and then he pulls up in a small compact car. It's just great, and I think a wonderful kind of encapsulation of the qualities of this pontificate. So let's first talk about the White House speech. The speech at the White House is really interesting, and to me, I'll have to say, a little surprising. At the time, I happened to be in a TV studio giving live commentary, and there were a couple of things that I noticed. First was certainly a gracious welcome. President Obama even called Pope Francis Holy Father, which is something a Catholic normally would say, but a non-Catholic might say Your Holiness or something like that. And when Pope Francis entered into his remarks, he emphasized freedom and religious liberty. And when he did so, he looked directly at President Obama. This is something that the media did pick up on and much was made out of. And I think I would have to agree that even though the point might have been subtle, it really seemed as though the Pope was echoing or reiterating some of the U.S. Catholic bishops' oppositions to aspects of Obamacare, particularly the Health and Human Services mandate that would require institutions to provide support for contraception. But also in his remarks, Pope Francis referred to quote-unquote unjust discrimination. And this is something that really did fly past most people in the media, because it seemed to me that Pope Francis was taking a line directly out of the Catholic Catechism. And so for those of you who read the Catechism, you might be familiar with this. The Catholic Catechism says quite explicitly that unjust discrimination against homosexuals should be resisted. And this is an interesting point because it obviously leaves open the question about whether there could be just discrimination. And so I think what Pope Francis was doing is he was trying to balance a variety of political and theological interests in his speech at the White House and his interaction with President Obama. And to my view, or in my opinion, I saw the initial framing of the pontiff's remarks as a kind of recalibration to a certain extent, in which Pope Francis was not portraying himself as some kind of liberal in a conventional American sense, but instead that he was reiterating concerns that American bishops have had in relation to Obamacare, particularly providing contraceptive support, or the contentious issue of gay marriage. And so immediately I sort of thought that Pope Francis had prepped in some ways to allay concerns that some members of the American Catholic hierarchy had about not necessarily the direction of his pontificate, but the public perception of his pontificate. But it's also important to understand that during these White House remarks, Pope Francis did balance this implicit criticism or concern with praise for President Obama's approach to environmental issues, and of course he ended with a statement of concern for the poor and marginalized, which is a signature theme of this pontificate. And so, at the very least, I think what was on display in this initial speech was that Pope Francis is neither a liberal nor a conservative when seen through the lens of conventional American categories. Quite simply, he's Catholic, and in emphasizing issues in the way in which he does, he actually does confound many American observers who are expecting a different combination or a different set of issues that he might support. And so, for example, when I was in the TV studio watching this speech and getting ready to comment on it, the news anchor asked me whether Pope Francis was going to allow gay marriage or whether he was going to allow women priests, and I said, I don't think so. But at the same time, Pope Francis emphasizes social justice issues such as the environment or opposition to the death penalty in ways that, say, American conservatives or many American conservatives might be uncomfortable with. So I think it's important to understand that Pope Francis doesn't fit into the kind of neat categories that we're often used to in the United States when we talk about political issues, that in some ways or in many ways Pope Francis transcends those kinds of categories, and he's trying, obviously, as Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church, to be consistent in the issues in Catholic doctrine that he emphasizes. The next speech that I would like to talk about is how Pope Francis addressed the American bishops. And here he did say something that was somewhat surprising to me and many other observers. I had once again been asked for a prediction about what he would say to American bishops, and I actually expected a kind of, if not necessarily harsh and stern speech, at least a demanding one, in which he would call his fellow bishops to reach out much more strongly to laity and to live lives of more simplicity and humility. And he certainly did emphasize those themes, but he also said some things that did strike me as being rather surprising. But first, obviously, he emphasized concern for the family, since he was coming for a global meeting on the family. He also emphasized concern for immigrants, and these are both issues that the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops have emphasized. So he's very much in step then, or wanted to indicate that he's very much in step with the approach the U.S. Catholic bishops have taken to these two issues. And he also warned, though without being accusatory or scolding, about the dangers of narcissism in religious leadership. So this is obviously a theme that Pope Francis continually reiterates and strikes, which is that those who lead within the Church need to serve, and that they need to understand their positions as one of service, not as lordship, shall we say. But what Pope Francis did say that was surprising was his praise of American bishops for their approach to the sexual abuse scandal, particularly for their quote-unquote openness to self-criticism. And some observers and commentators might argue that the American Catholic bishops, in any case, only began to deal with the sexual abuse scandal because of significant outside pressure, and also that there's more work to be done. But here again, I think you see a kind of recalibration in these comments. Many American bishops have expressed their concerns about this papacy, and of course the vast majority of them were appointed either by St. John Paul II or Benedict XVI. So I see Pope Francis's remarks as an effort to, for lack of a better phrase, buck up the morale of American bishops. But he was also insightful because he connected the mortification and self-criticism that the American Church has experienced to a process of divestment. And what he was referring to, at least I think so, implicitly, was how the American Catholic Church has often had to pay out, obviously, large legal settlements that have bankrupted dioceses. And for Pope Francis's view, the flip side of this is that the American Church will become much more truly a church of the poor and distance itself or be fully or more fully divested of its worldly power and authority. So what he was trying to do in some ways was to put a kind of spiritual spin on this process that is obviously ongoing but also very painful for American Catholics. And at the end, obviously, he emphasized the need for healing. But I think what was surprising is that he didn't take a more aggressive stance, because he's not afraid to challenge bishops, especially challenge bishops who are perceived to be removed and not associating with their flock. And so I was a little surprised, because I thought the speech would be more hard-hitting, but he did balance a variety of concerns in his speech. And I know many priests have felt rather demoralized sometimes when Pope Francis criticizes the privileges of the priesthood, and so this in some ways counteracts that, I think. Obviously, the most significant event during Pope Francis's American trip was his speech to Congress. It truly was a historical moment, and as I'm sure all of you know, and many of you have personal experience with, in the not-so-distant past, it would have been unimaginable that a pope would have been invited to Capitol Hill, let alone to give a speech to Congress. So times really have changed, and changed quite substantially in relation to the position of Catholics and Catholicism within American society. And in his speech, obviously, Pope Francis did mention what are now familiar themes of his pontificate: concern for the poor and marginalized, concern for immigrants, and also concern about the environment, and his identification of the times in which we live as a very important civilizational moment for dealing with environmental issues. But for me, what was perhaps most interesting was how he drew upon American examples to make his point. He first mentioned Abraham Lincoln and used Lincoln's example to speak about the common good and about the Catholic values of solidarity and subsidiarity. He also used Lincoln as an example of a politician who understood politics as being based upon, quote unquote, our compelling need to live as one. And I think that's a very powerful encapsulation of politics, at least as an ideal, our compelling need to live as one. And certainly it was a message that needed to be delivered to Congress, because regardless of your political affiliations, it's clear that we live in a very divided country politically nowadays. Then the Holy Father moved to speak of the example of Dr. Martin Luther King, and particularly his march to Selma. And through Dr. King, or through Dr. King's example, Pope Francis emphasized the need to welcome immigrants and refugees, but also to reject the mindset of hostility. And I think this is really quite important, because what Pope Francis is identifying is the uniquely Christian character of Dr. Martin Luther King's path of protest that was assertive, that claimed rights for African Americans, but also did not demonize the opposition, and did indeed reject a mindset of hostility. And so in many ways, this is what Pope Francis is saying is this is a wonderful Christian model for how we should pursue social justice, even among those who try to resist us. The Pope also mentioned the witness of Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, and her concern for the poor and marginalized, and he connected this to the need for all of us to share our financial and natural resources. And I was particularly intrigued that the Pope mentioned Thomas Merton. My dad really loved Thomas Merton and had first editions of all his books, and for Catholics in the 1950s and the 1960s, Thomas Merton was a seminal figure. He was a monk, and he was also, toward the end of his life, very concerned with the interaction with Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. And so what Pope Francis said was that Thomas Merton was a model of dialogue. And one of the phrases that struck me quite strongly when the Pope was talking about Thomas Merton was how Thomas Merton, before his conversion, described himself as loving God yet hating him. And I think in some ways, too, implicitly, the Pope is addressing the new atheism, a very aggressive form of atheism that challenges not only Catholicism but all religious traditions. And perhaps the Pontiff is identifying kind of belief in God or curiosity about God that underlies even some of these most aggressive atheist statements that would provide, in some ways, a framework for dialogue. So I think the inclusion of Abraham Lincoln, Dr. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton was significant for a number of reasons. First, or number one, Pope Francis was essentially identifying Catholic values as American values, or vice versa. And this is particularly significant, obviously, since for a very long time, Catholic values were thought to be antithetical to American values, particularly regarding freedom and democracy. When my dad converted to Catholicism in the 1950s, he was from a well-to-do family in Boston, and many of his family's friends gave him books about Catholic conspiracies to take over the United States, or how American Catholic power was incompatible with American democracy, and so on and so forth. And clearly what the Pontiff was saying is that there need not be a clash between values that are considered to be characteristically American and Catholic values. Secondly, or number two, the Pontiff was also acknowledging that there is an indigenous American Catholic tradition. And this is itself important. For example, in many quarters in Europe, American Catholicism is kind of looked down upon as either not being Catholic enough, or being too new, too modern, and so forth, or somehow less ideal than Catholicism in the quote-unquote old world. And so with the mention of Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day, we have acknowledged by the Pontiff to Americans as significant religious leaders in the 20th century. Third, or number three, the Pope's advisors, I think, served him very well in preparing these remarks. I don't have any inside knowledge about this, but I would credit the mention of Abraham Lincoln particularly to the intervention, advice, or at least example of Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, who's been one of the strongest advocates among bishops for religious liberty. And I also see unidentified but unmistakably Jesuit hand in the mention of Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, simply because both Merton and Dorothy Day were at the edge of culture. That is, they were where religion and secular culture meet in some ways. And they were out front in engaging and contending with social changes of the time, and that's very much within the Jesuit ethos. As I'm sure all of you know or are aware of, just as the Pope's visits earned praise, it also evoked at least some controversy. And certainly the most controversial part of his trip was his meeting with Kim Davis in Washington, D.C. And as I'm sure as many of you know, Kim Davis has protested the issuing of marriage licenses to gay and lesbian couples in Kentucky, and the pontiff met her at the Papal Nuncio's residence in Washington. And so there are two basic interpretations of what happened, two opposing interpretations that we could set up side by side. The first was that Pope Francis was siding unequivocally with opponents of gay marriage. After all, and this is certainly true, while Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Pope Francis or Cardinal Bergoglio had called gay marriage the work of the devil. And so this meeting with Kim Davis was taken to be a kind of reaffirmation of the necessity for conscientious objection or resistance to legalization of gay marriage. On the other hand, some people weren't so sure, and some people argued that the pontiff had effectively been set up by the Papal Nuncio and simply wasn't really aware, at least not fully, about who Kim Davis even was. And so this is a controversy that is still swirling, though it has died down somewhat, but certainly immediately after the Pope's visit, this is something that achieved quite a deal of national scrutiny. My own take lies somewhere in the middle of these two extreme views. While in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken, Pope Francis did meet with nuns who were challenging the Health and Human Services mandate regarding contraception. So I do think it's clear that Pope Francis is a supporter of much of what the American bishops are saying with regard to religious freedom. And I also think it's pretty clear that Pope Francis doesn't support gay marriage as a kind of institution, though he's certainly very, very open to pastoral approaches to welcome gay and lesbian Catholics into the church. But I also do believe that Pope Francis probably wasn't fully briefed about Kim Davis either, and certainly not fully aware that not only was she refusing to issue marriage licenses, but she was directing others not to do so as well. And so I think if he had been more fully aware of the specifics of her case, he perhaps would have been a little more circumspect. And so we'll have to see how things develop in this regard. But I do think in some ways Kim Davis's remarks about the meeting were rather opportunistic and perhaps don't fully encapsulate either the reality or the ambiguity surrounding how the meeting was set up and what Pope Francis knew and what he was intending. Altogether, I think it's obviously fair to say, the Kim Davis incident notwithstanding, that Pope Francis's trip was a success, both pastorally and politically. Now, obviously, he's not a political actor in a conventional sense, but he does have, I think, very sophisticated political sensibilities, and there are a variety of constituencies within America, particularly within American Catholicism, that the Pope had to respond to during his trip, and I think he did so quite well. And so the question is, what can we look forward to in the coming months or years depending upon how long this pontificate lasts. Well, certainly something quite significant is occurring right now as we speak, which is the Bishops' Synod in Rome, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. And what's particularly striking to me is how open bishops have been in their disagreement. There's been a lot of sniping back and forth and using the media to engage in what often seem to be almost ad hominem attacks against other parties. And it's clear that the bishops are not going to reach consensus on some of the most vexing issues that they're supposed to consider, such as reaching out to gay and lesbian Catholics or to those who have remarried outside the church without an annulment. But this has ushered in, I think, a new kind of openness. And Pope Francis, even though he did apologize for some of the quote-unquote scandals surrounding the synod, Pope Francis does want open and honest discussion. And so to that extent, the Synod of Bishops, as it's going on now, as it had taken place last year, reflects this Jesuit concern, I think, with airing views, exploring creative alternatives, but at the same time affirming foundational elements in Catholic doctrine. I don't know what the final outcome will be, since Pope Francis will, it's within his authority to issue a final document, but I think he will probably try as best he can to balance the competing interests of the bishops, but open up, at least on a local level, new pastoral approaches which do not violate or compromise or seem to compromise established aspects of Catholic doctrine. What's happening at the Synod now, I think, is particularly important as a prelude to the Year of Mercy, which will begin in December. And I think it is during the Year of Mercy that we will see some surprises. Of course, since there'll be surprises, it's hard for me to predict exactly what they will be. But I think the Year of Mercy is a time when Pope Francis really does want to do something significant and substantial to reach out to many people, not only who feel alienated from the church, but people who are marginalized, feel broken, and for whom Christ and his message of mercy can provide an answer. So I think what we should look forward to within the next year perhaps aren't so much pronouncements, though maybe there will be an encyclical associated with the Year of Mercy. We will certainly hear about off-cuff remarks and actions that the Pope will take under his own initiative that will try to embody this spirit of mercy, which he considers to be so important and so central to articulating Christian message in a world that's rapidly changing, but also in dire need of love. So with that, I will conclude my formal remarks, and I would be very grateful for any questions that people have, and we will try our best to field them all. And I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity to me, and for all of us to connect, albeit virtually, is a wonderful affirmation of what we do here at Holy Cross and the community that we share and the friendship that we've created.
Well, now as we allow Professor Schmalz to take some water and to collect himself after that wonderful presentation, I just want to take this opportunity to thank him for being with us today, for sharing his expertise and knowledge. We've had a wonderful response to this webinar, and now it's the opportunity to shift it over to you, our listeners. We've had a number of questions that have been posted on the chat form throughout Professor Schmalz's presentation. I encourage you throughout this Q&A period, which will last about 15-20 minutes, to submit any questions that you might have, and we'll get through as many of them as we possibly can. So Professor Schmalz, one question that we have, and there's been a lot of interest in this, is your comment on an indigenous U.S. Catholic tradition or culture. So a few people are wondering, with this historic visit to the U.S., how can you forecast the impact on rank and file Catholics in the U.S. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think a simple way to put it is that it's cool to be Catholic again. And I think all of us who are American Catholics have really, really felt over the last decade the weight of public scrutiny and the weight of the sexual abuse scandal. And there is, I think, a feeling of lightness with this pontificate. And so I think that in many ways this emphasis upon mercy, on openness and dialogue is something that can be quite impactful if it filters down into parishes. And I think what I would like to see, or I think maybe perhaps to put it this way, what the pontiff would like to see is not this openness and concern for welcoming others be solely a matter of priests or the clergy. But a responsibility that all of us have as Catholics to reach out to one another and to heal the many wounds that people feel as Catholics and as human beings. So I think the most significant change, perhaps, or the most significant impact is just the change in atmosphere that will allow, I think, new possibilities and new issues to be discussed.
Another question is about the media. Were you surprised with the wall-to-wall coverage that the Pope's visit demonstrated on cable outlets like CNN, like Fox News, things like that? Were you surprised about the media's reaction to the Pope's visit or coverage of the Pope's visit?
Yeah, I was, and I think that's a very insightful question in some ways, because what has really struck me is how invested non-Catholics are in this pontificate. Obviously, to those who are Catholics, the Pope coming to the United States is a significant issue. It is for American bishops, the American clergy, and so forth. But what's particularly striking is how many non-Catholics have responded to this Pope and also are deeply interested in what he has to say. And so the wall-to-wall coverage, I think, in one sense probably is a function of our 24-hour media cycle, but in another sense really does reflect this Pope's ability to cross conventional boundaries and to bring in other people into the discussion. And clearly he's not just energized Catholics, but non-Catholics as well.
A question about preparation for the visit. You touched a little bit about the Papal Nuncio, maybe in relation to the Pope's meeting with Kim Davis. Who advises the Pope on U.S. matters, or who helped prep him for this visit to the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't have any inside information on this. Usually what would happen is the nuncio would be the key point person. And also perhaps a representative of the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. What I do think happened, however, behind the scenes is some bishops or cardinals giving their own input into how the pontiff should frame his remarks. And I particularly think that Cardinal Timothy Dolan and Cardinal Chaput of Philadelphia probably played a significant role in encouraging Pope Francis to recalibrate somewhat his remarks vis-a-vis the hierarchy, so that what he said could not be interpreted as somehow not in step or not consistent with public positions that the U.S. Catholic bishops have taken.
This is all assuming good health and a lengthy papacy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you forecast another visit to the U.S. anytime in the relative near future? And what may bring the Pope back to the States? Would it be something like the meeting of families in Philadelphia? Can you talk a little bit about that, possible future visits to the United States?
I could see Pope Francis within, maybe not in the next 2 years, but maybe within the next 3 years or 4 years, making a visit to the West Coast, particularly because of the large Hispanic population, and also because I think he recognizes, as do the American Catholic bishops, that the gravity in American Catholicism is shifting and changing. And so I would envision perhaps a West Coast visit and something perhaps more specifically focused on issues concerning immigration. But I don't know of anything upcoming in the near future, for example, that would bring Pope Francis here. I think what's interesting too, and what needs to be appreciated about Pope Francis, is that for him, you know, the United States is not the center of the world. And I think that while many of us as American Catholics would obviously like to have him back here, he's also head of the global church, and so he's very concerned about Catholicism in Africa and Latin America, where Catholicism is quite vibrant and expanding. So I would assume that his attention will be directed to those parts of the world within the next couple of years, though he may return to the United States after that.
A lot of questions about Pope Francis's Jesuit worldview or Jesuit upbringing. And in your opinion, how does Francis's Jesuit persona impact his decisions in the papacy? Or what has his Jesuit worldview brought to the papacy?
I think on a obviously sort of surface level, I mean, what you can say is that his concern for social justice is something distinctly Jesuit. I mean, the Jesuits see themselves as being in the world and engaging the world in its fullness and in its complexity, and obviously Francis has done that. On a deeper level, however, I think his spirituality, though quite Franciscan in some ways, also draws upon Ignatian principles. Certainly one of the most significant things that Pope Francis has said in this pontificate is that he described himself as a sinner. And he wanted to emphasize that he wasn't just sort of saying that as a slogan, that he really meant it, that he really was a sinner. And this Jesuit emphasis upon the examination of conscience and taking one's own responsibilities seriously in relation to God and in relation to others, I think is very much part of the way in which Pope Francis understands himself and also understands the way in which we as human beings need to cultivate humility. Humility not only about ourselves, but humility in relation to God.
Some additional kind of follow-up to the previous question about kind of long-term impact on U.S. Catholics about this visit. There's a few questions about how do you think the Pope, the papacy in general of Pope Francis, but specifically his visit to the U.S. and the message that he's getting across to leaders and to other Catholics, how will that impact men possibly joining the priesthood? Do you think this will have an impact on that, or maybe not? There's some questions about kind of long-term impact on men joining the priesthood.
That's a really good question, and I have to say that I don't have a lot of great insight into that because there are all these different theories actually swirling around out there about what attracts people to the priesthood. So for example, during the pontificate of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, it was often said that because the priest was being, or the specialness of the priest is being re-emphasized during those pontificates, the vocations would increase because being a priest was seen as, once again, being something distinctive, being something that conveys a special kind of authority and so forth. I would say that Pope Francis's understanding of the priesthood is not fundamentally different, but he emphasizes different kinds of issues, such as, or qualities such as humility and service. What I can see, if this pontificate continues over the years, is a greater enthusiasm about being Catholic, and particularly making the kind of radical choice that Pope Francis believes being a priest means, which is accepting a life of poverty, a life of service, and so forth. But we'll have to see. I think the Pope does obviously have tremendous power within the Catholic Church and all, but he's also a symbol, and I think the real indicator or impact on vocations often comes locally on the parish level, or what we do here at Holy Cross, as opposed to what is done in the Vatican.
That's a good segue, because there are some questions that bring this very much close to home, and there's a few people that are curious to see from your perspective, how has the Pope's visit to the U.S. had an impact on this campus, on the Holy Cross campus, specifically our students? Has the classroom dialogue changed a bit? Can you talk a little bit about the impact here on campus?
Well, people are really excited, and I'm actually glad you asked that question, because I was during Pope Francis's visit, I did have two discussions in the two classes that I am teaching this semester, Comparative Religions and Ancient and Medieval Hinduism, actually, about Pope Francis. And I was actually preparing to go on live with Chris Matthews, and he wanted me to talk about the Pope's impact on young people, and when I got on MSNBC, Chris Matthews asked me about the environment and didn't ask me about the impact on students. I think there is an excitement about this pontificate, and a sense, too, that lay Catholics and women will have more avenues for expression. Secondly, there is a heightened interest in social justice issues, particularly surrounding immigration and the death penalty. And three, I think this is what's really interesting, what came out in my classes, is that many non-Catholics who study here at Holy Cross feel much more connected or included in the Catholic tradition than they have in times past, that Pope Francis's openness, his willing to dialogue, reiterates for them what they experience on this campus, which is attitudes of welcome, inquiry, engagement, and creativity. And so there's been a kind of coming together, I think, on campus around Pope Francis and his emphasis on social justice and mercy.
We have time for a couple more questions. One of which, and there's been a few around this topic, is the role of women in the church. And do you see the Pope being able to have an impact on that? Or what do you see the Pope possibly doing with regard to giving women a greater role in the church?
The potential impact that he could have, I think, would be allowing female deacons. This was a suggestion actually made by a Canadian bishop, that within the contemporary discipline of the church, you could conceive of having female deacons. So that is something perhaps that we might see. I think that would obviously be controversial in some quarters and be seen as moving toward women in the priesthood, which would create a great deal of controversy. But in addition to perhaps women deacons, certainly I think what you'll see are women in more positions of responsibility when it comes to governance, and perhaps in the Vatican itself.
Do you think Pope Francis, this is going back to precedent that his predecessor set, do you think Pope Francis will serve for the rest of his life, or might he retire, quote unquote, in the same way that that Benedict XVI did just prior to him?
Well, that of course depends on various imponderables. For example, there was just this report which was denied by the Vatican that the Pope has a non-malignant brain tumor. We know that part of his lung was removed. And he's often talked about his pontificate being short, and he has not spoken against the idea of resigning. Having said all that, I think if Pope Benedict were still alive, I can't see how Pope Francis would consider resigning, because then you'd have two emeritus popes, and what is already a complex situation would become even more confusing. However, I could see him at some point resigning as a sign of humility. And humility is a very, very important theme for Pope Francis. And I think a personal divestment from the office of the papacy would not be beyond imagining when it comes to him, though I think certainly as long as Benedict XVI is alive, Pope Francis will continue in the See of Peter.
So final question, it's bringing the discussion back to the topic, his visit to the U.S. Professor Schmalz, in your opinion, of all the many different messages that the Pope addressed throughout his different visits throughout his trek in the U.S., what do you see as the Pope's top priority or overarching message? What was the maybe the one thing that the Pope wanted to get across more than anything during his visit to the U.S.?
That God loves each and every one of us and offers each and every one of us mercy, and that because of that we must love and show mercy to one another. Pope Francis talks very specifically about a number of issues, reaching out to the poor, to the marginalized, to immigrants. He has stated his opposition to the death penalty. He has stated his concerns about contemporary capitalism and the way in which the environment is treated. But I think overarching all of these specific points that he makes is that God does love us and offers us mercy, offers us the opportunity to be with him. And so therefore, we ourselves as human beings have to show love and mercy to one another in creating a world where all people are included, all people feel loved, and also where the environment too is protected and treated with the dignity that it deserves.
Well, many thanks to Professor Schmalz for sharing his time and knowledge with us today. We hope to continue offering these lunchtime learning webinars in the future. I encourage you to stay tuned for upcoming notices about future dates. And in the meantime, have a great afternoon. Thank you for joining us.